Hi everyone, this is Dr. Young. Our class is Intro to Africa at Flagler College. Today we're going to be discussing some examples of the period between the 1960s and early 1980s of post-colonial or independent Africa, looking at kind of some of the trends there through a few case studies. And this will pick up from the discussion that we had last time on sort of the basics of that era. If you recall, there were a number of political issues that we discussed and a number of economic issues we discussed. So let's see how that played out in a few African countries. Our first example is Ghana. Okay, so we recall Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African country, except for Ethiopia and Liberia, which had been independent. Well, Ethiopia really only had a 5-year period of being ruled by a European power that was Italy in the late 1930s, and they were liberated in 1941. So you can barely call that a colonial experience. Liberia became independent all the way back in the middle of the 19th century, and so that's another example that kind of lay outside of the whole colonial experience. But of all the sub-Saharan African countries, Ghana was the first to gain independence from a colonized situation. And it did so largely through the skillful political maneuvering of Kwame Nkrumah and the Convention People's Party. And Nkrumah was one of the leading proponents of this whole strategy that we discussed in the last lecture, to co-opt the resources of the more productive sectors of the economy and to use that to fuel the growth of more modern, industrialized, developed sectors of the national economy, right? So Ghana had a productive agricultural sector like many of the countries in Africa did, in the Gold Coast colony. Various crops had been grown there during the colonial period, things like coffee. They were still growing things like palm oil, and I think there were probably rubber plantations and other things. I'm not absolutely sure about that, but coffee definitely was a big one. These were grown in Ghana on large plantations controlled by the colonial interests, using the labor of mostly African peasant farmers. This was still a productive sector. Well, Nkrumah went ahead and nationalized that and began to try to siphon the proceeds from the agricultural sector into the building of industry. And so in the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Ghana actually did industrialize rapidly. They built lots of factories. They started massive projects like hydroelectric dams, and all of this was with the intent to bring Ghana into the modern world, to make it compete industrially with the rest of the world. And it looked like things were going really well. And Nkrumah, in fact, turned more and more to the nationalization of the resources, really to systems of socialism. And then, in the 1960s, the market turned against the agricultural products that Ghana was producing. Nkrumah and his government had borrowed a great deal of money from foreign interests, foreign governments. They were deeply in debt, and the projections that they had made, upon which they based their spending habits, did not come anywhere near the levels that they had hoped or projected for, right? And so this left Ghana in a terrible situation. Nkrumah responded to protests by becoming increasingly autocratic, and this is one of the most disturbing trends politically in the post-colonial period of Africa, that these leaders, highly educated, often highly westernized leaders. Nkrumah had been, at university in the United States, and had a lot of allies. He knew how to speak the language of the West and sort of talk a good talk and all of that. but he sort of turned against the principles which he had espoused earlier in his career. At one point in the early 60s, I think it was about 64, Nkrumah proposed an amendment that would make the Convention People's Party. Let's recall this other trend that the single party system tended to be how these nations sort of functioned for a long time. It took a very long time to produce a credible opposition and to have multiple political parties. Well, to head off that possibility, given that there was dissent in Ghana, Nkrumah proposed a constitutional amendment that would make the Convention People's Party the only legal party in the country, and that would effectively make him the de facto dictator, right? This did, they held a national election for this, or a kind of national referendum for this amendment. And according to the official tally provided by Nkrumah's government, the amendment passed with over 99% of those, the people of Ghana voting yes on this, right? Well, anytime you see statistics like that, it's almost guaranteed to be fraud, right? And this is also one of the trends I think we see politically in post-colonial Africa, is we have these landslide elections for the people who are in power, which tends to indicate a great deal of manipulation of those elections, not really counting people's votes honestly, and trying to display the veneer of popularity for the proposed proposed amendments and things like this that these governments were trying to force into the political systems of their country, right? So all of this bred resentment of Nkrumah, and there were a lot of protests. He tried to crack down on this, but in 1966, as he was on a state visit to China and North Korea, Nkrumah's government was overthrown in a military coup, and Nkrumah was entirely removed from power. I think he actually had to go into exile for a number of years. I'm not sure, what the exact details are there, but Nkrumah was overthrown, and the government of Ghana passed into military hands. And this would be another trend, right, in post-colonial Africa, that militaries, national militaries, would often take over the governments of countries, and even when there was pushback against that, the government or the military leaders who had staged the coups then would retire from the army, make a big show of retiring, and then run as civilians for government posts, and again win huge landslides, right? So this whole cycle of military coup, transfer to civilian government, which really just meant the generals retired and became civilian leaders, and then setting it up for the next military coup, becomes the pattern for many places. That certainly is the case for much of post-colonial history in Ghana, at least into the 1990s. A couple other examples of socialist experiments. Tanzania is a good case, and the old colleague of Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, became the first leader of that country after independence. Nyerere, like Nkrumah, saw as the only solution really to make Tanzania viable as an economic force was to nationalize and socialize the industry, and the economy of the country, right? In Nyerere's case, again, agriculture was key to this because it was the most productive and most common sector. Nyerere went as far as doing things that had only been attempted by, among others, Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. Actually, around the same time, Nyerere and Mao were doing this. Agricultural collectives. So taking poor farmers from the rural settings and forcing them to move onto these collective farms that were administered by the government. The name for these in Tanzania was the Ujamaa. So these Ujamaa ultimately would co-opt about 20% of all of the arable land in Tanzania. These were put into cultivation by these collective farms, but as institutions that are part of a command economy tend to do, these were tremendously unproductive, right? I mean, people were not really incentivized to go and work because they were working for the government. All of the produce, all the things that they grew were seized by government officials and sold, and they were, they really didn't see the benefit of this. And so these Ujamaa were models of unproductivity. Even though they controlled about 20% of all of the arable land at their height in the 1960s, they, according to many estimates, many projections, they only produced about 3% of all of the food and other crops that were grown in Tanzania. That's how inefficient and unproductive they were. The picture that you see here on the slide, and I got this from the Getty Museum website, I think, or something, which is why it says Getty Images. But it shows a picture of a group of workers on one of these Ujamaa in Tanzania in the 1960s. And you have people there with their traditional hoes, their digging implements, digging up these mounds. You probably don't need that many people there at the same time. This is a kind of visual study in unproductivity. And there are, you can see people standing around behind them because they can't get in to the place where they're digging, right? There were places that did have some success, and these were countries that tended to resist the move towards socialism and instead allow for what we would call agricultural capitalism. Though, of course, the two-edged sword there is that the largest landholders tended to command the largest share of the economic proceeds. And so, both in Kenya and in Cote d'Ivoire, for instance, there were huge plantations for the growing of coffee and other agricultural goods. And these remained in both places in the hands of wealthy landholders, and in some cases, often with the collusion of European governments, their former colonial masters. But this did produce a more vibrant economy than these socialist experiments did. And Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire and other places that tried this tended to be a little better off economically, even if many of the people remained in abject poverty, working for those who owned these big plantations. One of the most troubling examples of a country in post-colonial Africa is Nigeria, right? And we've said repeatedly, I think, in this class, that Nigeria is one of the most complicated places, ethnically speaking, in the world. One country that has like 250 separate ethnic groups speaking 250 separate languages. The way that decolonization happened in Nigeria just exacerbated some of the tensions. The indirect rule systems that the British had used there were more effective in the north with the Hausa and Fulani chiefs than they had been in the south. There had been more sort of dissent against colonialism, sorry for the yawn, in the south of the country. And so, the British wanted to make sure that this would pass into the hands of people they could work with because there were a lot of resources in Nigeria. And so they sort of forestalled independence until 1960, when the Hausa and Fulani in the north were able to organize effectively, and in sheer numbers they were slightly larger, so that when the parliamentary elections were held, first in Nigeria, the northern ethnic groups came into control of the largest number of seats in Parliament, which meant that they got to appoint the Prime Minister and several of the other kind of cabinet officials, and they tended to control politics at the federal level, though this was done with concessions made especially to the Yoruba population in the southwest of the country and the Igbo population in the in the southeast of the country. These were the other two largest ethnic groups, along with the Hausa and Fulani. And the Hausa and Fulani, by the way, are closely related to each other historically, so they tended to kind of ally. Now, that said, there were, again, 250 ethnic groups, all of them living in some kind of minority status in these different regions of the country. The Constitution of Nigeria, sort of written in the initial phase of independence, guaranteed regional autonomy for both the North and for the Southwest and Southeast, which meant that regional politics were dominated by the largest ethnic groups, again, the Hausa Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the southwest, and the Igbo in the southeast. And these minority groups were kind of left out of the equation. They didn't have any recourse to public power, to political power, and they came to resent the lion's share of the power being handed to only these three ethnic groups, right? This was made even more complicated by the way that resources stacked up in Nigeria. Nigeria, of all the African countries, probably has the largest oil deposits. Libya also has fairly substantial oil reserves. But massive oil deposits in Nigeria, and it's this nice, light, sweet crude, as they call it, this easily refined petroleum. And so, this is an incredibly lucrative thing, and this newly independent nation came to rely greatly on oil and to a secondary amount on cash crops like palm oil and coffee and rubber and things like that. And so they would take from these sectors to try to industrialize, but because there was this regional autonomy, the largest oil deposits are in the Niger Delta region, in the area controlled by the Igbo, and they, of course, wanted more direct control over this. They didn't want this to pass into federal hands, and so these are the kinds of things that bred tensions. Now, in 1966, there was a coup d'état staged by Igbo officers of the Nigerian military. And this touched off a very complicated sequence of events that led to a 4-year civil war in Nigeria. The Igbo coup began this. There was a counter coup by some of the minority group officers who belonged to some of these minority groups. And in response to that, the Igbo officers fled back to the Igbo region, and they, working together with other people, declared the independence of that whole region from Nigeria, making it, ostensibly an independent country called Biafra. All right. Now, honestly, Nigeria might have been okay just to let Biafra go, except, and you can probably guess, for the oil issue. The most lucrative resource, the vast majority of the reserves were located in Biafra, and so the Nigerian government simply could not let this go, and they ended up fighting a war to keep Biafra in Nigeria. And this became one of the most inhumane and brutal wars in the post-World War II era. It really became more a war of attrition and we might say a war of starvation than anything. The Nigerian army effectively blockaded the entirety of Biafra on the land with troops, even with the warships out in the sea, kind of hemming in the Niger Delta, trying to keep the oil reserves inside of the country rather than let Biafra sell them to foreign countries or to foreign firms, and thus come up with the money that would enable them to continue to prosecute the war. And so this blockade, the Nigerian army didn't necessarily do a lot of direct attacks on Biafra. They were content to just let Biafra kind of starve themselves into submission. And over the course of 4 years, it's thought that upwards of 1 million people died, most of them probably of starvation or diseases attendant on starvation. You can see the Life magazine image here from, I believe, can I see closely there? I think it's from 1969, where, we've got these children suffering from kwashiorkor, this disease, which really is due to a lack of protein in the diet. which means that their hair comes in with no color in it. Protein is necessary for melanin, which is the skin and hair pigment, right? So, their hair comes in looking blonde almost, or looking like a towhead. And children with kwashiorkor tend to also have distended bellies. This is a physical response. Essentially, the body is eating itself, and they often end up with parasites and other things as well. And so, I mean, these are tragic scenes. Hundreds of thousands of people, mostly the vulnerable parts of the population, the children, the elderly, and others who were subject to diseases easily, ended up starving to death or dying of disease. And there was a lot of foreign intervention. There were only 7 countries in the world who acknowledged the independence of Biafra, acknowledged Biafra as an independent country. 6 of them were in Africa, and I forget exactly which ones acknowledged this. The other country, the only one outside of Africa, was Haiti, of course, in the Caribbean, right? Which felt, I guess, a kinship with Ghana, given that Haiti was one of these countries that had gained its independence due to a revolt of slaves. And so none of these countries, though, had a lot of clout internationally. There were aid groups, Oxfam, and I'm not absolutely sure if Oxfam was involved, but I imagine they probably were. But aid groups in Europe and the United States who, took the Biafra War and the humanitarian crisis there as a kind of cause célèbre, began to do airlifts of food into Biafra. And quite frankly, even though this probably made people in the West feel good about helping, a poor African child who was dying of starvation, almost certainly these airlifts prolonged the war. And, the food probably ended up in the hands of people who already held power and may not have made it to the most vulnerable parts of the population anyway. And so, but this did give the leaders of the Biafra independence movement the kind of confidence that they continue to prosecute the war because they had food coming into the country. And that probably just meant it lasted much longer and became even more of a humanitarian crisis. The law of unintended consequences, as it so often is in the case of kind of foreign intervention, definitely reared its head there. Biafra finally surrendered in 1970. And given that Nigeria had been fighting a war for 4 years at this point, they ended up with a military government starting at that point. And they, they sort of forced through a new constitution that multiplied the number of states rather than just 3 autonomous regions. There were, I can't remember how many states, but a lot more, at least a couple dozen states. And this took power out of the hands of these large ethnic groups to a great extent, though it did remain mostly in the hands of military people. And Nigeria did really well for themselves in the early 1970s, emerging from this war with oil prices soaring, with OPEC effectively working together, a massive energy crisis all over the world as a result. But countries that had oil did extremely well. And Nigeria did well, though that was, a boom and bust kind of thing. And they came to depend on these massive proceeds that came from these high oil prices. As soon as those oil prices started to go down, they were not prepared for that. Their resources simply could not handle this downturn in the oil market. And, by the early 1980s, when oil prices, I remember from when I was a child, they went down, it was down like 70 cents a gallon. In the place I lived in the western United States when I was 8, 9 years old. These countries that were dependent so heavily on oil for most of their economy suffered for years, more than a decade, I think, with oil prices remaining that low. And so this contributed to the instability of Nigeria. Nigeria, even more than Ghana, has seen its cycles of coup d'etat just over and over again, where military leaders will take over the country, oust all of the, the government officials, rule as simply military dictators for a time, and then hold civilian elections where the leaders of the army then retire from military life, become civilians, and win a likely manipulated election, become the president or prime minister of the country, and effectively keep power in the hands of the military where they came from, right? Until the next group of officers decides that the civilian government is not doing well, and they get the support of the people, and they stage a coup d'etat, and just over and over and over again in Nigeria, really until about a decade ago, or maybe a little bit more. The early part of this century, in fact, Nigeria began to stabilize, but it still does have its serious political problems, and any of these things could kind of start at any point, I think. Our last big example here, because I want to spend the next lecture entirely on South Africa. And for that, we're going to have to go back a bit and pick up the narrative from the colonial era. So I'm going to reserve an entire lecture for South Africa. But we've been following several of these countries sort of pretty consistently all through this history. And so let's take a look at Egypt here. When we last left Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser had, first of all, came to power via a coup d'etat, and then won an election in 1956 as a civilian, became the president of Egypt, and had kind of bested Britain and France and Israel for that matter, even though they didn't necessarily do that militarily. Through skillful diplomatic maneuvering, managed to make the British and French attempt to seize control of the Suez Canal, which Nasser had nationalized. He came out on looking the better part, certainly better than Britain and France did on that. And this gave Nasser a great deal of confidence to continue reforming Egypt, right? Going back, into the 19th century, Egypt had been dominated by these large landholders who controlled the lion's share of the wealth. Most people, lived as tenant farmers or as migrant laborers in Egypt. Well, Nasser intended to put an end to that, make the society more equal via nationalization and socialism. So he nationalized the industry and the agriculture and a number of other sectors of the economy, and brought about socialist reforms, the likes of which we're seen in other parts of the continent, and certainly in places like the Soviet Union and China in this period. So he had guarantees to all poor farmers that they would receive a wage from the government for their work, even if they didn't own their own land. They would have guaranteed education for their children, and lots of other amenities, access to health care, and so forth and so on. These were the guarantees that Nasser made, and these all made him tremendously popular with the majority of the Egyptian population. His government pursued policies of land redistribution, stripping land away from the significant landholders and giving it to poor peasant farmers. Reducing the instance of tenancy and rents and things like this, and making people independent landholders. Also, via government decrees, government policies, he reduced rents, placed a price ceiling on the amount of rent that a landholder or a landlord could charge for housing in the country, and also set a price floor for wages that employers had to offer to their employees. Sorry for the yawn there. If you know anything about economics, you'll know that these kinds of manipulations rarely work, and they often actually just exacerbate existing problems. But Egypt did attempt this, and these things were wildly popular. At the same time, with Egypt had a significant population, one of the highest populations of any country on the continent, behind Nigeria certainly, but Cairo in this period I think was probably the largest city in Africa, not passed by Lagos yet. But Nasser, there's the excess population. Nasser sort of contracted with other countries in the Arab world, so on the Arabian Peninsula and in Mesopotamia and places like that, Iraq and Saudi Arabia, to send laborers from Egypt, really the poor working class population of Egypt, to other parts of the Arab world where they would be put to work on public projects and other things, right? So a great deal of employment migration, some of this essentially dictated by Nasser, but it did provide jobs for people. It did force them to move at the same time. Nasser became, and this may be the most significant point about Nasser, became the great champion of pan-Arabism and to some extent of what we would call pan-Islam, right? Pan-Arabism, the prefix pan, of course, means sort of across an entire entity. In this case, the whole Arab world, all of the Arabic speakers, people who consider themselves to be Arabic in ethnicity. Nasser set himself up as the great champion of this, right? In a way, this was an attempt to harken back to the medieval caliphate, except that he was proposing that the leadership would be more secular and certainly socialist, right? That he was encouraging socialist reforms all over the Arab world, and he set himself up as a kind of leader there. Nasser envisioned a kind of joining together of socialist policies with the tenets of Islam. He tried to, in a way, co-opt Islam, the religion, from his main rivals, which included, the Muslim Brotherhood, certainly, who wanted to institute a society based on Sharia law, on Islamic law. Nasser sort of set himself up as this great champion of Islam, this incredibly pious figure, but he brought about reforms that really undercut the fundamentalists, the Wahhabists, functioning in the Al-Azhar Mosque in Cairo, which was sort of the de facto intellectual leader of the entire Muslim world. Nasser tried to get a handle on all of that, and he became the great champion of the Arab cause internationally. Egypt was almost certainly the most powerful of all of the Arab countries, after all, and so this kind of made sense. And this led him into direct conflict with Israel again, right? So the single most important issue by far in this period, and really up until fairly recent times, I think this probably still is the biggest issue in the Arab world, is the existence of the state of Israel, right? That Israel is an independent nation with a large Arab population, and the land of which was claimed by Arabs was in fact historic Palestine, right? And when Israel declared independence in 1948, they pushed much of the Arab population militarily out of the land controlled by the Jewish people into places like the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the Golan Heights, this Arab population was many of them ended up as refugees in Egypt and Jordan and Syria, these fairly newly independent nations in the Middle East. And so Nasser said, well, we want to be the great champions of the Arab people and of Islam, and so he made a lot of jingoistic motions toward Israel, began massing troops and working together with the leaders of Syria and Jordan to do the same. And it's almost certain that they were planning to attack Israel at some point. But in June 1967, Israel did a preemptive strike and ended up within a few hours wiping out the entire Egyptian Air Force, and they began to send ground troops, and the Air Force continued to fight against Syria and Jordan. Israel also sent ground troops into the Gaza Strip, which was technically Palestine and acknowledged by the United Nations even as Palestine. Into the West Bank, same situation there. This was legally, internationally recognized as Palestine, and into the Golan Heights, which sort of had been part of Syria, and you know, actually, I take that back. Gaza was Palestine, but the West Bank was technically at this point controlled by Jordan and the Golan Heights by Syria, right? So, these were the places where these Arabs had gone after they were kind of forced out of the rest of Palestine slash Israel in 1948. And so, Israel moved into these territories with ground troops, made it all the way to the Jordan River in the West Bank, through the Golan Heights in the northeastern part of the country, and through not only the Gaza Strip, but entirely across the Sinai Peninsula, thus taking control of a significant amount of land that was part of Egypt, right? These places that Israel now occupied, and within 6 days, hence it's called the Six-Day War, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan had to sue for peace, and Israel came out the victor, right? Now, these territories that Israel now controlled ended up becoming some of the most contentious pieces of real estate on earth, and they have remained so all the way to the present, through negotiation internationally with the brokerage of the United States and others. And by the way, as a socialist government, Nasser had allied with the Soviet Union, and much of their military equipment came from the Soviet Union, whereas Israel was getting most of its stuff from the United States. And so this was a proxy war as well for the Cold War. Okay, so we have to see it in that context too. This was a huge embarrassment for Nasser. On the last day of the war, he actually resigned his post as the prime minister of the country, or as the president of the country. And there was a groundswell of support for Nasser, given the massive popularity he enjoyed at this point in time. And so he then rescinded that decision a day later and resumed his tenure as president. He had only, a couple of years before this, won another term as president. These terms were very long, by the way. So, so he continued to rule over Egypt, though. This was a huge black eye for Nasser, a massive embarrassment for his otherwise successful record. And he continued sort of to remain in conflict with Israel. There was international settlement, like I was going to say, that passed the Sinai Peninsula back into the hands of Egypt, but the Gaza Strip, which Egypt had administered for a time, remained in the hands of Israel and would become one of the three, as they were called, occupied territories, right, along with the West Bank and the Golan Heights. The Six-Day War changed a lot of things, right? That conflict continued. Nasser died of a heart attack in 1970, rather suddenly. Actually, he was still functioning completely in his office. He passed. Power passed, I should say. He didn't necessarily do it himself. Power passed to one of his deputy vice presidents, the guy pictured right next to Nasser. So this is Nasser with the sunglasses on. This guy right here is Anwar Sadat. He became then the president of Egypt in 1970. And initially, he continued to pursue these anti-Israel policies. Israel and Egypt ended up in another conflict in 1973 when the Egyptian forces attacked Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Egypt did make some gains into Israel at that point across the Negev. But Israel then regrouped and pushed Egypt back, and in fact had advanced into the Sinai Peninsula again when a peace was brokered by the United States. The Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir had grown up in the U.S. and depended very heavily on American advisors, and certainly felt a debt to the U.S., felt pressure from the U.S., and so she pulled the troops out of the Sinai. Much to the chagrin of many people in Israel who wanted to continue to prosecute this war and sort of deal a death blow to the military pretensions of Egypt. And in a way, this brokered peace remained tense, but Sadat began to change his mind. Over the course of the 1970s, There were sort of secret diplomatic negotiations between Israeli officials and Egyptian officials. And finally, in the late 70s, around I think 1978, 79, Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed a mutual agreement effectively ending hostilities and normalizing the relations between the two countries. Egypt acknowledged Israel's right to exist, which it never had done before, and this, gave both Begin and Sadat the Nobel Peace Prize. And in any case, this really sort of changed the nature of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Now, this is a class on African history, and that's sort of beyond the scope of this, right? But this thing that had animated Egyptian politics and certainly Egyptian foreign policy for a couple of decades at this point was effectively normalized by 1979. At the same time, due to the socialist and nationalist experiments, the government ran up huge debts. I mean, the public sector was by far the largest. They were borrowing a lot of money from the Soviet Union and other places to feed the growing economy. And, this left the public sector deeply in debt. And more people joining the public sector, often kind of the multiplication of bureaucratic offices, which made the whole thing inefficient, again, as command economies tend to be. And so economically, Egypt was overly reliant, like many other countries in Africa, on this massive public sector and needed to make some changes, make some reforms in order to bring its economy into better shape, right? And we'll talk about, some of those measures that were more or less forced on African countries by the international community in the 1980s in the next couple of lectures. Okay, so that brings us up to a discussion of South Africa, which needs to be its own lecture. And so we'll talk about that next time. Thanks.